Welcome back to Institutional Psychotherapy, Legacy and Constellations of Frances Toscayes. Thank you for joining us for the second day of the symposium. A quick note that a closed captioning in English is available by clicking on the CC button at the bottom of your screen. All the conversations are translated live in American Sign Language. I'm Mathilde Walker-Billot, Curator of Programming at the American Folk Art Museum. And I'm joining you today from Queens, New York. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that our museum stands upon Lenapehoking, the unceded traditional homeland of the Lenape Delaware peoples. We honor Lenape people, past, present, and future, and are committed to centering Indigenous perspectives in exhibitions and programs at the museum. As I mentioned yesterday, the symposium, Institutional Psychotherapy, Legacy and Constellation of Frances Toscayes, is organized in conjunction with the exhibition Frances Toscayes, Avant-Garde Psychiatry and the Birth of Art Brut, now on view at 2 Lincoln Square until August 18th, along with a concurrent exhibition, Somewhere to Roost. The exhibition introduces us to Frances Toscayes and his time at the Saint-Alban Psychiatric Hospital in southern France from 1940 to the early 60s, where he devised a series of revolutionary psychiatric practices that came to be called institutional psychotherapy. The exhibition also examines the history of mental health and institutionalization in the United States through the works of American artists such as Martin Ramirez and Judith Scott. Next slide. As you can note in the schedule, the symposium features 2 conversations and 4 panel discussions. Yesterday's program, entitled Institutional Psychotherapy, An Intertwined History of Psychiatry and Politics, explored the social and political context in which Toscayes developed his practice and how his specific approach to politics, community, and institutions can be understood in regard to the search for disability justice and anti-psychiatry movements in the US. Today's program, entitled Institutional Psychotherapy, An Intertwined History on Psychiatry and Culture, will put into perspective the artistic and intellectual life at the Saint-Alban Psychiatric Hospital and the legacy of institutional psychotherapy in Western arts and humanities. Closing remarks by W.J.T. Mitchell and Hannah Zevin will address mental illness and its representation from a critical and historical perspective. So as you can see, we have another rich and exciting program ahead of us. Today, we'll begin with the 3rd panel of the symposium, entitled Saint-Alban-sur-Limagnole Psychiatric Hospital, a Laboratory for the Arts, with Raphaël Koning, Valérie Rousseau, Kara Cabañas, and it's introduced and moderated by Alison Moorhead. Following this panel, there will be a 30-minute break and we'll resume the program at 1:30 p.m. with the 4th and final panel of the symposium, From Occupational Therapy to Disability Art, with Suzanne Hudson, Barbara Rodriguez-Munoz, and Amanda Caccia, introduced and moderated by Emily Watlington. And after another 30-minute break, W.J.T. Mitchell and Hannah Zevin will close the symposium with a conversation that starts at 4 p.m. Please do submit your questions in the Q&A feature, because we will take some questions after each session, and we want to hear from you. I'll be using the chat room to share more details about the speakers and the program. And please note that the speakers may reference terms that were commonly used by the medical community in the mid-20th century. This is historical language that is not currently used to address mental illness. Throughout the talks, we will contextualize and unpack this language. So if in case you have any question, any thoughts about terminology, please feel free to share your thoughts in the chat. And we're here to listen, learn, and provide nuanced information about these historically charged issues. Today's program is being recorded and will be made available online with closed captioning and ASL interpretation in the coming weeks. We wish to thank the Institute Ramon Llull, Nina Beatty, Suzanne Weller, and the Anthony Petullo Foundation for their generous support for this symposium and making these 2 days of scholarship possible. I hope you'll consider supporting our programs with donation to the museum following this symposium. Your support has great impact and makes a difference in our ability to champion the work of folk and self-taught artists. Thank you. Next slide. And now it's my pleasure and honor to invite Alison Moorhead to introduce the panel Saint-Alban-sur-Limagnole Psychiatric Hospital, a laboratory for the arts. This first panel of the day charts the significance of the Saint-Alban Psychiatric Hospital in the production of arts from World War II to the early 60s and the framing of post-war modernism. Alison Moorhead is Associate Professor of Art History at Queen's University and co-director of Confabulation Art Practice, Art History, Critical Medical Humanities. Please join me in welcoming Alison and all our presenters.
Thank you so much, Mathilde, and welcome to everyone to the second day of this online symposium and to the first panel of today. And for those of you who weren't here perhaps yesterday, or also for those of you who were, I just want to note that this first panel mirrors yesterday's first panel, which asked whether Saint-Alban was a laboratory for political resistance. We start today with our three speakers exploring to what extent, if, and how Saint-Alban and other similar institutions might be understood as laboratories for the arts. So you'll notice that both panels yesterday and today have a question mark at the end of their titles. I'm going to introduce all three of our speakers now, and then I'm going to hand it over to them for their presentations before I return to moderate our discussion. And as Mathilde mentioned, please do put any questions or comments in the chat. I'll moderate them as we go, or I'll monitor, them as we go along. And then I'll attempt to bring in as many as I can into the conversation, which I'm really looking forward to. And just to say, yesterday was fabulous. So thank you to the speakers and the organizers for yesterday. So our first speaker today is Raphael Koenig, who is currently Assistant Professor of French and Francophone Studies at the University of Connecticut, having previously in 2019 to 20 held the Leonard A. Lauder Fellowship in Modern Art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and having received his PhD in comparative literature from Harvard University in 2018. Raphael's research focuses on the interplay between mental health and artistic production, especially with regard to the reception history of works produced in psychiatric institutions in France and Germany. His recent publications include Portals, the Visionary Architecture of Paul Gouache, which he co-authored with Robert Wiesenberger, and which appeared with Yale University Press and the Clark Art Institute in 2023. And he also, another publication is the edited volume, Art Brut, an unclassifiable object, ? Which came out with Bordeaux University Press in 2021. And Dr. Koenig's talk today is entitled Art Making, Work Therapy, and the Society of Gévaudan, Reframing Artistic Production at Saint-Alban. Our second speaker is Valérie Rousseau, which many of you, I assume, will know already as the curator of the exhibition that that prompts our gathering yesterday and today. Valérie Rousseau is the curatorial chair for exhibitions and the senior curator at the American Folk Art Museum in New York. And she's overseen a number of critically acclaimed exhibitions, including Willem van Genk, Mind Traffic from 2014, When the Curtain Never Comes Down from 2015, and this exhibition received an award from the Association of Art Museum Curators. She also curated Art Brut in America, The Incursion of Jean Dubuffet in 2015, Photo Brut in 2021, and Morris Hirschfield Rediscovered in 2022. And she's also curated projects on the legacy of Francesc Tosquelles, as we're gathered to discuss today, the concomitants of psychiatric and artistic avant-gardes, and this project was supported by a FACE Foundation Curatorial Fellowship, Étant Donné, in 2019. Projects on neurodiversity with the support of an Institute of Museum and Library Services grant, which is ongoing, 2023 to 2025. Projects on art brut literature, on art environments, and on artists, including William Edmondson, Eugen Gabrishetsky, and Madalena Santos Reinbold. She authored a book on Bill Traylor, which received an award from the Festival International du Livre d'Art et du Film in 2018. And most recently, the article Regardez par les failles de ce monde, Intersection de l'art brut et de l'art populaire, which appeared in Les Cahiers du Musée National d'Art Moderne here just in 2024. And she also guest edited The Fate of Self-Taught Art, which was a special issue for the Brooklyn Rail in 2018. Dr. Rousseau's talk today is entitled Auguste Forestier, Beyond the Confines. And our third speaker is Kaira M. Cabañas, who is Associate Dean of Academic Programs and Publications for the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts, otherwise known as the Center, at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. Cabañas is the author of multiple volumes, including most recently Immanent Vitalities, Meaning and Materiality in Modern and Contemporary Art. And this book, Immanent Vitalities, which came out in 2021, received the Frank Jewett Mather Award from the College Art Association. Her earlier book, 2018, Learning from Madness, Brazilian Modernism and Global Contemporary Art, which is a touchstone, I should say, for my work in teaching, was a finalist for the Modernist Studies Association Book Prize. In 2012, she co-curated and edited the catalog for Spectres of Artaud, Language and the Arts in the 1950s, an exhibition that was held at the Reina Sofia in Madrid. Cabañas is currently at work on a book entitled Deviant Art Histories, From Radical Psychiatry to Cultural Citizenship. And her talk today is entitled Effective Catalysts, the Brazilian Difference. So welcome to our speakers. Welcome to all of you out there, especially those I cannot see through this screen. And I'd like to turn it now over to Raphael.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Alison, for this generous introduction, and thank you, Valerie and Kaira, also for participating in this panel. I'm very much looking forward to a discussion. And as a preamble, I would like to thank the exhibition curators, Carlos Guerra and Joanna Masso, for being wonderful and generous interlocutors in this ongoing project, as well as co-curator Valérie Rousseau, and Mathilde Walker-Billot, Richard Ho, our valiant sign language interpreters, and the entire team of the Folk Art Museum for this invitation and for putting together this exciting and timely exhibition. I would also like to acknowledge the help and support received from a number of people at Saint-Alban, including Yves Baldran, Pierre-Hélène Charbonnel, and Aline Blanc. And I would also like to acknowledge the work of Sophie Legrain and her publishing house, Édition Dune, who has been instrumental in making a number of crucial works by Tosquelles available to a wider audience. So I'll just start sharing my screen. Today, I will be speaking about a specific episode of French intellectual history, the interconnection among organized resistance activities, progressive psychiatric practices, and a renewed attention to the patient's self-expression at the Saint-Alban Psychiatric Hospital in Lozère. And specifically focusing on the period of like the German occupation, so during kind of World War II, so early Saint-Alban, basically. And a relatively small institution in a kind of mountainous area of southwest France, Saint-Alban had an outsized impact on post-war thought, as was mentioned in yesterday's panel, both as a result of its wartime activities and through the writings of some of the medical interns who were trained at Saint-Alban in the immediate post-war period, most notably Félix Guattari and Frantz Fanon. My research on Saint-Alban, which has already led to several publications, will constitute a chapter of my first monograph that combines methodologies of medical humanities, art history, and philosophy to analyze the reception of works produced in psychiatric institutions in France and Germany in the mid-20th century by poets, philosophers, and artists such as André Breton, Jean Dubuffet, and Hans Prinzhorn. This monograph focuses on the way in which these works acted as catalysts to question systems of normativity with regard to mental health and artistic authorship. What drew me specifically to the history of Saint-Alban is that while actively participating in groundbreaking theoretical debates, and we will delve into that a little bit more in detail, that attempted to redefine the notion of mental health and the boundaries of a so-called normal and pathological, artists, writers, and psychiatrists who worked at Saint-Alban were also interested in drawing from these debates to implement changes in healthcare and in the daily lives of patients at the institution. At the Saint-Alban Hospital, lively theoretical debates and social experimentation were conducted in close coordination. And one could argue that the notion of practice, actually, that Tosquelles draws from Marx's 1844 manuscript, is already kind of at the foreground of their kind of philosophical elaborations. So there's actually no gap, let's say, between theory and practice at Saint-Alban. Both, like, even the word coordination doesn't quite render the fact that they are thought of in the same breath, so to speak. That such developments took place in the distressed atmosphere of wartime occupied France and happened while the hospital also hosted an active resistance network, lends to these events a particular sense of urgency. The Saint-Alban experiment was instrumental in bringing about a new understanding of the relationship between mental health and society, namely that mental health issues were not to be understood merely in the context of isolated individuals, but that one person's mental health was necessarily impacted by the wider social and political conditions in which they lived. What makes the Saint-Alban experiment both challenging and an exciting object of study are the multiple overlaps between intellectual debates, various kinds of practices, including psychiatric care and political activism, and a diversity of artistic productions ranging from avant-garde poetry to self-taught sculpture and textile art. My research on this topic thus adopts an interdisciplinary methodology at the crossroads of medical humanities, so that is the study of the intersections of literature and medicine, but also art history, history of psychiatry, and philosophy. The first part of this talk is about thinking about Saint-Alban in context. During the German occupation, the psychiatric hospital of Saint-Alban was used as an asylum in the literal sense of the word, that is to say, as a refuge for Jews, resistance fighters, and other dissidents from the Vichy regime. And it's important to notice that those are often overlapping categories. You could have like Communist Party members who are also resistance fighters, who are also who might also be Jewish or foreigners, or like, so all of these categories are not siloed, let's say, but often overlap. This could be seen as a result of a kind of geographic determinism. Located in Lozère, in one of the most in one of the least populated and poorest of the French départements, Saint-Alban is situated on the Margeride Plateau. So just to give a sense of like the geographic location of Saint-Alban, far enough from large urban centers where the authority of the occupying army and the Vichy regime was more directly enforced. And this encouraged centrifugal tendencies and anarchist leanings just by being further away from centers of power and possible interventions from, like, let's say, Vichy regime police or the German army, much like the Zomia of the high plateaus of Southeast Asia, theorized by Yale-based anthropologist James C. Scott in his 2009 book, The Art of Not Being Governed. And yesterday we talked a lot about conflict and the way Saint-Alban helps us to rethink kind of different types of conflictuality. I think this is also something that we can throw into the mix, this type of the role of the geographic location and geographic determinism in encouraging experiments, let's say, like Saint-Alban, right? And it is very much like a condition of possibility of a Saint-Alban experiment, this geographic determinism by virtue of which high plateaus and more remote areas, like the vast area of Southeast Asia straddling the borders of Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, and China, described by Scott, can offer pockets of self-rule resisting the often violent encroachments of centralized state powers. This phenomenon was also the result of a generous policy of taking in refugees and endangered persons of all kinds, initiated by Dr. Paul Balvet, director of the hospital from 1936 to 1943. So Saint-Alban took in a variety of people who felt they were, quote, mutually incompatible, end quote, with the Vichy regime. Many decided to take advantage of the geographic distance and political climate of the hospital, receiving work assignments at the hospital through legal means. That is to say, without actually going into hiding. So two configurations: either people were admitted to the hospital, as was the case of Éloi, under a pretext to basically hide them, protect them by hiding them under the patients, or they were, in the case of medical staff, legally nominated to the hospital, but with also the idea of having this act as a refuge, right? So this is the case for Tosquelles, who got there in January 1940, André Choron in January 1941, and Lucien Bonafé in December 1942. And Saint-Alban gradually became one of the bases of the French resistance, linked directly with some of the most significant resistance networks, like Libération Sud and the University of Strasbourg group. Among the dozens of resistance fighters clandestinely housed within the hospital, we have to name Paul and Anouche Éloi, who lived there from November 43 to February 44, and briefly put Saint-Alban at the center of clandestine literary production in close cooperation with René Amarger's printing workshop in the neighboring town of Saint-Flour. So that's an example of this kind of leaflet. It's actually kind of an A4 paper that is folded to create like a tiny kind of volume that Paul Éloi, under the pseudonym Jean Duhaut, had printed at Saint-Flour, like a neighboring town to Saint-Alban, and he oversaw the publication himself, very meticulously, as we were told. So even if it was a kind of clandestine operation during the war, he still had his kind of professional literary figure kind of hat, and made sure that the publication was on point and no comma was missing. And then Georges Canguilhem, of course, was at Saint-Alban in June and July 44. And we also should mention Jacques Matarasso and Léo Matarasso, brothers. Léo Matarasso was the leader of the Libération Sud network, and Jacques Matarasso, who is a photographer, is also the author of these kind of stunning photographs of Anouche and Paul Éloi with his brother Léo at Saint-Alban. That play with kind of exposition times to create kind of light effects. So an important thing to kind of deal with and think about when thinking about Saint-Alban is the notion of collective structures. Relatively informal discussions took place at Saint-Alban, and from 1943 onwards, under the joint impetus of Bonafé and Tosquelles, a structure called Société du Gévaudan was created to oversee these exchanges. The parodic nature of this name is beyond doubt. It evokes an old-fashioned, learned society, implying excessive localism and abstruse research, and also is also a reference to kind of local lore around the 18th century cryptid known as the Beast of Gévaudan, which only adds to its incongruity. So this is actually Auguste Forestier's take on the Beast of Gévaudan. It's assumed that it was actually some kind of large wolf, if it existed, or I mean, it's somewhat unclear. And this farcical name was designed to distance the group from any notion of hierarchical authority by means of self-irony. A useful metaphor that can be found in Tosquelles' writing, applied to the discussions of a society of Gévaudan, is that of a subway map, with discussions and debates not necessarily progressing in a linear hierarchical fashion, but branching out in several main directions that coalesce to form a coherent whole. And here I would like to echo what Carles was saying yesterday, that we have to resist the kind of lionization of single figures and try to find interpretative frameworks to account for the collective nature of this endeavor. So I found this image of a subway map that's suggested by Tosquelles very useful. I would like to single out two main lines of inquiry from this subway map: renewed attention to patients' self-expression and the importance of work therapy. A major line of inquiry featured in these discussions aimed at contesting psychiatric nosographies, meaning kind of systematic, structured taxonomies of mental health issues, systematized descriptions, which were later famously criticized in the opening chapters of Michel Foucault's Madness and Civilization from 1961, as derived from the classificatory practices of botany, classifying mental pathologies as one would for plant species. These discussions are echoed today in the debates around the DSM, for instance. Saint-Alban psychiatrists were thus interested in developing new diagnostic tools that will allow them to account for the specificity of each patient's worldview, as opposed to reducing them to a single diagnostic category. Paying specific attention to each patient's self-expression in verbal, written, or visual form thus became of paramount importance. And here I would like to quote from the manual that Tosquelles produced for the kind of staff, for nurses at the hospital, encouraging them to pay specific attention to behavioral traits and spoken utterances from patients. Try to describe the patient's expressions to the doctor as faithfully as possible. The doctor will take interest in small signs with which he will be able to study the structure of the delirium, will be able to establish a diagnosis. So you must all be attentive to the spontaneous statements of your patients and carefully write down any changes in delusional themes. So this was very much, let's say, hospital policy. And in some cases, for instance, in the case of Prinzhorn, the specific kind of renewed attention to these kind of spoken utterances or behavioral traits in order to establish an individualized diagnosis were instrumental in bringing about this kind of shift in works that are produced by patients in psychiatric institutions, that were put in the patient's medical files, and then later kind of collected, added into university collections, hospital collections, and with a later kind of shift towards exhibiting them as artworks, a shift that can be debated, questioned, but that's mostly a trajectory for someone like Prinzhorn, for instance. In the case of Saint-Alban, this kind of shift in the perception, in the reception of works, comes from a second line of inquiry that's actually more operative to talk about these works. And it is the importance of work therapy within the hospital and the hospital as a kind of social experiment. So in the last few minutes, I would like to, so the traces of this spoken word utterances can actually be found within notes that Éluard took and then translated into poetry. So you can find them in Éluard's poems, for instance. That's one way in which you can see this practice kind of traced back to Éluard. So from his book of poems, Memories from the Madhouse, Souvenirs de la Maison des Fous. And when we come to the hospital as a social experiment, it's important to mention that there were kind of practical measures in place to encourage work therapy or ergotherapy, and it meant to constitute a path towards economic autonomy, whereby patients would be paid for their work. So this might mean, for instance, taking part in activities of subsistence agriculture to bring food for the hospitals. Like there's a whole range of activities under this work therapy rubric. But art-making practices by patients were similarly encouraged as a means of reclaiming personal agency and economic autonomy, because these works were produced to be sold to the local population directly by the people who made them. So this is especially the case, for instance, for Auguste Forestier. I think Valérie will talk about it later on, who is maybe the most famous patient artist from Saint-Alban. Just a few examples from Forestier. During his time at the hospital, he developed a mixed media technique based on wood carving and assemblage. So just a few examples. Marguerite Sirvin developed a technique of upcycling found fabrics, unweaving and unspooling them, and reusing the thread to create intricate embroidered compositions on cloth. A large number of them relate to idealized memories of family life. These works attracted the attention of Éluard during his stay at Saint-Alban, who later brought them with him to Paris and championed their artistic qualities within leading art circles, including artist and collector Jean Dubuffet, who integrated a number of his visual productions into the canon of what he termed art brut in the second half of the 1940s. The relative success of artistic productions by Saint-Alban in the post-war period could be described, I would say, as a mixed blessing. They afforded immediate visibility to the Saint-Alban experiment. However, this visibility also came at the cost of distortions that affected the reception of his works for decades. So art brut, which is Jean Dubuffet's concept, and was applied to these works, was proposed in the late 1940s by Dubuffet as a new category of artistic production. He posited that works of art brut had to be cut off from usual mechanisms of artistic production, such as traditional artistic training. He defined brut artists as radically isolated individuals. I believe Joanna mentioned that yesterday. She also mentioned this quote from Jean Dubuffet's 1968 Asphyxiating Culture, where he has this general definition of a brut artist as a desert island, so somewhat absolutely radically isolated from society. And needless to say, applying these ideas to Forestier or Sirvin thoroughly disregards indications that these works were in fact created within a collective structure promoting patient empowerment through work therapy. And to conclude, I would say that we can maybe have two types of models to understand the discrepancies and potential incompatibility between the Saint-Alban experiment in its own logic and art brut. I would say maybe a horizontal model for Saint-Alban of kind of enforcing non-hierarchical strategies of empowerment that aim at kind of opening up divisions between patients and medical staff, between the hospital and the rest of society, by recreating the hospital as a kind of social microcosm, also very concretely kind of like destroying the walls around a hospital. So this kind of strategy of kind of horizontal egalitarianism, as opposed to what I would call Dubuffet's vertical model, isolated artist, in touch potentially with some type of autochthony or rootedness that is a type of kind of ethno-nationalism that Dubuffet kind of favors in his writings. And a kind of meaningful, I think, anecdote to conclude is that through Jean Houry, Dubuffet tried to order a totem to be created by Forestier to put in front of his art brut collection, the building that was housing his collection. Why the totem? Well, it is kind of a 20th century anthropological category within anthropological literature, and it was meant to represent a type of kind of rootedness, belonging, mythical connection to the ground. Forestier did not create this work that Dubuffet was requesting, because it was very much outside of the range of what he usually created. Also in terms of size, he was creating relatively small figures, not kind of large totem poles. But we could say that Dubuffet, to a certain extent, tried again with Chessac. Chessac, who was creating totems, for instance, with totem number 5. He tried to order a totem from Chessac to be a representative of a collection L'Art Brut, And finally, Dubuffet created his totem himself, we could say, with his series of tour figures that ended up being realized in a monumental form in the 1980s, and that to me kind of embody this notion of isolation, rootedness, verticality of Dubuffet's art brut model that we can, if we try to systematize it, oppose to the horizontal, egalitarian, open nature of the Saint-Alban experiment. And I will conclude here on the horizontality versus verticality. Thank you so much for your attention.
I would like to first take a moment to thank Joanna Masso and Carles Guerra for their groundbreaking research on Tosquelles and for welcoming me and my colleagues at AFAM to join this important project. Thank you as well to the co-organizers of the Tosquelles exhibition, the CCCB in Barcelona and the Abattoir of Toulouse for their ongoing support. I would like also to acknowledge the crucial role played by key individuals and organizations in preserving and sharing these dispersed archival documents that allow us to tell this story. The family Urabat Tosquelles, the Collection de l'Art Brut in Lausanne, the Institut Jean Vigo in Perpignan, the Succession Gérard Vulliamy, Luc Volatier, the various filmmakers included in the exhibition, as well as residents at Saint-Alban. I'm thinking of Mireille Gauzy, Yves Baldran, and the staff of the hospital. It was really a great collective effort. So the Psychiatric Hospital of Saint-Alban in southern France witnessed the concurrent birth of two distinct projects on its grounds: institutional psychotherapy and Art Brut, with Frances Tosquelles and artist Jean Dubuffet at the forefront of this story. Institutional psychotherapy, with regards to mental institutions, understood the failing of these structures to be symptomatic of the illnesses of a larger social and political body. Art Brut, with regards to a broken Western canon, sought to further radicalize the reevaluation of artistic legacies that began at the turn of the 20th century. Tosquelles arrived in Saint-Alban in February 1940, recruited from the Cedefond concentration camp, and took the leadership of the hospital alongside Dr. Lucien Bonafé. Upon his arrival, he was impacted by the Nazi collaborating French Vichy government and its self-extermination policy, to which Camille Robsis referred yesterday, which eliminated basic resources for psychiatric populations. With 852 patients facing a state of emergency, Tosquelles oversaw a radical transformation of Saint-Alban. Dubuffet's intersection with this story occurs in 1945, in the immediate after-war period. Dubuffet traveled to Saint-Alban, primarily triggered by a desire to meet one of its artist patients, Auguste Forestier, whose sculptures became a catalyst for his conceptualization of Art Brut and marked the beginning of his collecting activity. A closer look at Forestier's life at Saint-Alban and the ones of other patients like Marguerite Sylvain and Clément Fraisse exemplifies the distinctions between Tosquelles and Dubuffet's projects. Correspondence involving doctor on site, notes, and photographs shed light on Forestier's creative process and the collective environment of institutional psychotherapy in which he evolved, tackling question of ownership, the shifting status of objects created in psychiatric hospitals, and the circulation of patients' works intra and extramuros. Auguste Forestier, who was born in 1887, lived at Saint-Alban between 1914 and his death in 1958, a long 44 years. He was committed for sending a train off its rails at age 27 by placing stones on the tracks. So upon his arrest, Forestier explained, quote, "I wanted to see how the stones got crushed, and it didn't occur to me that I would derail a train." He went first in prison, where he carved wooden medals, later explaining that they had been given to him by the railway company as a sign of their appreciation. Arrived at Saint-Alban, he soon started to draw and carve animal bones. He later set up, on his own initiative, a working station in the corridor leading to the women's quarters near the kitchen, a location that enabled him to maximize his supplies. He had determined a perimeter for his working area, which is by itself an achievement regarding the usual circumstances of hospitals, overcrowded, deprived of private spaces. In the crate under a workbench, he stored his handmade tools and a large variety of materials, discarded pieces of wood, foil wrapping, string, metal wires, shells, mirror fragments, rubber from tire, and butcher bones. Then he shaped them into ready-made motifs, animal heads, wings, leaves, gargoyles, arms, costumes, decorative elements. At another time, he would assemble these motifs with at another time, he would assemble these motifs with nails to form sculptures of soldiers, bees, like the local legend of the bees of the Gévaudan, to which Raphael just referred to. Houses, likely inspired by the surrounding architecture of the hospital complex, which is a 14th century fortress with 4-tower castle, and anthropomorphic figures with beaks and cups cone. Most sculptures are dressed and facial features like mustache and eyebrows highlighted with black pencil. Super 8 film footage by Tosquier from the 1950s and photographs suggest that Forestier, like other patients, was involved in all levels of the hospital life, including the maintenance of the hospital, on-site construction projects, gardening, and agricultural work in local farms. Patients were no longer locked in cells and straitjackets were prohibited. We know that during periods of severe rationing in World War II, the hospital had already engaged in exchanges with the surrounding communities in order to overcome the shortage of supplies. Tosquier's goal was to bring patients out of isolation and precipitate social connections within a non-hierarchical structure, with an internal journal to which patients and staff alike worked side by side, a self-managed club, occupational activities, and day trips. In this incredible photograph, we see Forestier alongside the hospital staff, their kids and patients. His decorated cap recalls the ones he makes for his soldier sculptures, likely self-portraits or alter egos. While Forestier's artistic endeavors cannot be reduced to the effect of a therapeutic framework, ancestral psychotherapy and the organizational solidarity of the asylum village provided a favorable environment for the crystallization and the burgeoning of his production. In embarking on this labor of creation in relative seclusion, Forestier was generally left alone by the hospital staff, protected in ways similar to Adolphe Wölffli by Dr. Morgenthaler at La Waldau in Switzerland, for instance. Forestier's artworks began to make their way out of the hospital almost as soon as he started to create them. Dr. Maxime Dubuisson, the grandfather of Lucien Bonafé, who was leading the Saint-Alban Hospital when he was committed in 1914, compiled his drawings and those of other patients in 2 albums. In the medical field, at the time, creations by patients were used as diagnostic devices for mental illness, exploring the supposed links between artistic styles and mental conditions. Forestier will later display his sculptures on the walls of the hospital courtyard for trading and selling them to locals. Other works were acquired or donated to the hospital staff and their children living on site, who saw them as toys. At the height of the Nazi repression in occupied France, Saint-Alban opened its doors to hide persecuted intellectuals, Jews, and active members of the resistance, as Raphael just mentioned. So these outsiders who quickly blended into the hospital community came across the artworks and writings of its patient. The poet Paul Éluard, who took refuge with his wife Nouche at Saint-Alban from November 1943 to February 1944, brought several of Forestier's sculptures with him upon his return to Paris. Likewise, other Parisians like Pablo Picasso, Dora Maar, Raymond Queneau, and Dr. Gaston Ferdière, Antonin Artaud's doctor, also started to collect Forestier's work, which they obtained from people who stayed or worked in Saint-Alban, among them Dr. Lucien Bonafé, Dadaïst Tristan Tzara, and surrealist Gérard Vulliamy and Jacques Matarazzo. Within Parisian artistic circles, Forestier's works received great praise, as seen in recently uncovered photographs like these ones from 1944 to 46, where people are seen affectionately holding sculptures in various settings, on their laps during chess game, and in discussions as if they were children or amulet. In the spring of 1944, at Paul Éluard's residence, Dubuffet was first introduced to Forestier's sculpture entitled Le Roi Fou. The encounter was revelatory. In July 1945, right after the war came to an end, Dubuffet accompanied writer Jean Paulhan and Le Corbusier on a trip to Switzerland, where began his first methodical exploration into psychiatric hospitals and prisons, and during which he gathered a first group of documents that formed the basis of his Art Brut collection. It was also the inspiration of this very trip that prompted Dubuffet to coin the expression Art Brut. In September 1945, Dubuffet traveled to Saint-Alban, where he hoped to acquire the works of Forestier. Doctors and the community on site received him, welcomed him rather coldly, and didn't allow him to meet Forestier nor to see his works. Upon his return to Paris, Dubuffet reiterated his interest. Therefore, the high demand for Forestier's sculptures prompted Tosquelles to establish a framework that could facilitate the exchange of artworks with the outside world while consolidating the inner world of the asylum village. The profits generated from the sales of his works could be distributed equally between the artist and the Patients Club. Dr. Jean Houry, who did his residency at Saint-Alban under Tosquelles from 1947 to 1949, became Dubuffet's point person. In a letter, Houry reported that Dubuffet was interestingly, we reported that Forestier was, and I quote, very happy and flattered to know that some of his works would be exhibited in Paris, end of quote. In another, Dubuffet acknowledged receiving Houry's request for a crate size and insisted on paying the sculptures he received. Houry replied another time that the payment would be given to the club or Le Chemin newspaper, another newspaper within the hospital. And also other payment would be used to buy Forestier a good knife, a small saw, which he asked for. He commented also about objects to be sent instead of money that Forestier could attach to his cap. Forestier, who was highly selective in his choices of material, received, and I quote, with great joy, the insignia and amulets that Dubuffet had found for him in a shop in Paris, but unfortunately didn't appreciate the gris-gris from Yaya. I showed it to him, but he didn't keep it, reported Houry. Tosquelles initially greeted Dubuffet's collecting initiatives with skepticism, seeing him as an aesthete who seemed to forget the illness and the suffering, and appeared to commodify works that emerge as byproducts of patients' psychiatric treatment. Tosquelles had no interest in Dubuffet's countercultural sensibilities, as institutional psychotherapy sought to rehabilitate patients by bringing them back into various forms of labor and social exchange. Dubuffet's approach, which emphasized the singularity of a given creator and the object itself, the thing, was clashing with Tosquelles' focus on the process and collective life of the hospital. The living community founded on cooperation and the dialectic of exchange with others trumped art for art's sake. Dubuffet had taken an oppositional stance towards social exchange. Art brut conferred value onto final work, an object to be conserved and reinscribed. Moreover, he believed the emphasis on rehabilitation of artistic patients to be part of a larger scheme of exploitation underlying the field of psychopathological art. Dubuffet was opposed to the seclusion of these individuals on the basis of what he considered a false dichotomy between normality and deviance, and tried to separate these works from psychiatric stigma. Particularly attentive to primary sources and fond of non-professional art writers, Dubuffet had asked Houry to develop an article on Forestier for his publication series, Les Fascicules de l'Art Brut. Seeking facts without too many interpretation and comments, he requested, quote, "It would be good if the text on Forestier was not too scientific, too medical, and does not overuse medical terminology. It would be nice if there were elements of Forestier's biography in it and some facts concerning his actions, his ways of being, his physical person. In short, details which makes the character very much alive for those who don't know him," end of quote. Dubuffet inquired Tosquelles as well to provide precise facts about Forestier, but he refused to isolate the creative act. Quote from Tosquelles, he said, "But my dear, I can't tell you anything about Forestier. One day he offered me a cigarette, one day he talked about the train and the sun. I was more or less near him when he could not breathe and was fighting for his life. That won't help too much. And even if I were to communicate to you something for which there is no word, something I was able to see in his eyes when he was dying, how could I say it?" Nonetheless, Dubuffet's approach resonates with Tosquelles' medical staff training guide, to which also Raphael was referring, in which he writes, "Your task will be useful and successful if you know the patient and his psychology. And the more you love the patient, the better you will know him. Love and sympathy are essential and basic for the job of psychiatric nurse." As Dubuffet's collecting activities developed over the years, the conceptual parameters of Art Brut became more precise and evolved. He aimed, quote, "for an art which would be in immediate connection with daily life, as disclose an affective association, with the latter in turn linking an individual to a space of meaning." Confined within the normative framework of the hospital is a condition that impacted the nature of the art created in a logic of psychic survival. Forestier acknowledged the permanent separation from his previous life, being brought back after 5 escapes in Saint-Alban. In 1927, Forestier admitted accepting his situation, recognizing that he will be at Saint-Alban forever. His initial creative practice, which consisted of medals and pendants used to adorn his clothes, morphed into objects for others. Similarly, Marguerite Servin, a key artist in Dubuffet's collection, was brought by her family at the Saint-Alban Hospital in 1932, where she stayed until her death in 1957. She had worked in fashion stores in Paris and trained as a seamstress in her early life. Her creative output at Saint-Alban included embroideries and watercolors depicting family scenes in which a child plays a central role. Her most important work is a wedding dress made from the thread of unraveled discarded hospital bed sheets from the site in which people sleep, that she knit on using the crochet stitch technique. She had intensely devoted herself to this project over a 3-month period, imagining, and it's a quote from Dr. Gentil, that she was 18, that she was 18 and that she will came of age. And when she will came of age, she would be able to marry a suitor of her choosing. Somehow, she fashioned her exit strategy of the hospital, while the materials vibrantly seem to reassign unfulfilled needs, rest, security, love, sexuality, permeating the space of confinement in Saint-Alban. Since there were, and I will conclude on that, since there were no museum at Saint-Alban, the transactional dimension of Forestier's oeuvre had a decisive effect on the conservation of his works that would otherwise have been either abandoned or discarded. We often forget what motivates a collector to compulsively acquire. In that regard, Dubuffet's approach shared affinities with the ethnographic quest in the interwar period, this urgency to preserve the traditions and material culture of societies impacted by major shifts. The heuristic dimension of Dubuffet's investigation indeed echoes Marcel Mauss' manual published in 1947 and Georges-Henri Riviere's guide for ethnograph in 1942. Interestingly, in 1963, a few months before Tosquelles' transfer to Marseille, he gave some credit to Dubuffet, and I will quote him. I still have 3 or 4 small things by Forestier. All of these objects will no doubt be better protected and displayed in your museum, end of quote. Among these 2 objects are swords, like you see on this image. Impressed by the installation of Dubuffet's headquarters on Rue de Sèvres in Paris, Tosquelles fulminated against psychiatrists, and I quote, who have left to a painter the responsibility of fulfilling their most elementary duties, that is to take actions and conserve artworks by patient. In summary, the transactional dimension of Forestier's oeuvre not only contributed to the hospital's economy during a time of severe rationing. The social dimension related to their exchange, sale, and exhibition became for Forestier a point of connections to others in the sense of when it cuts a traditional object. And situating Forestier's set of action through various archival documents contextualized within the collective environment of institutional psychotherapy at Saint-Alban, we now better understand how Forestier might have wished his art to be activated. Thank you.
So I'd like to thank everybody, first Mathilde, and for the invitation, and everybody at the Folk Art Museum for bringing this exhibition to the US, to AV, Richard, our sign language interpreters as well, my co-panelists, Valerie, Allison, Raphael, and also my colleagues at the National Gallery who might be tuning in, and all of my colleagues in Brazil who have been so supportive in my work. So the title of my talk, as Allison mentioned, is Affective Catalysts, the Brazilian Difference, and I'll just piggyback on Raphael's use of the subway, metro map. So we're going transatlantic, we're going to Brazil, talking about not dissimilar developments in the Brazilian context. So with that, I will begin. In 1999, in a filmed interview at the Museu de Imagens do Inconsciente, Abraham Palachnik described how he would visit the city's Engenho de Dentro psychiatric hospital in the years 1949 to 1951. He narrates his first encounter with the hospital's art studio for patients, whom their doctor, already at the time, Misa de Silveira, would commonly refer to as clients. Palachnik had studied painting, but could not grasp the impressive work of these artists. Further reflecting on this moment, he explained, and I quote, "I saw that my world was ending. All of my castle collapsed. I was very overwhelmed, bewildered by these works." Almir Mavigné, who worked as the painting studio monitor, also a professional artist, comforted Palachnik and said, and I quote, "Calm down, let's visit art critic Mario Pedrosa. He also likes these works. Talk to him," end quote. Mavigné was 21 years old. Palachnik was his junior at 19. Palachnik ultimately gave up painting, and he began his now well-known cinechromatic work, an image of which you see on the right. During the years in which Mavigné worked at the painting studio as a monitor from 1946 to 1950, and I'm showing you, sorry, during the years Mavigné worked as the painting studio monitor, I'm showing you Mavigné on the upper left, Missa da Silveira on the lower left, and then the various clients' work, Emilio G. Bajos, Fernando Diniz, and Adelina Gomez, all on the same slide to kind of give you a sense of the network of clients working at this original moment of the painting studio's founding. In those years, he played a crucial role in establishing the studio's daily routine. He would show the patients how to mix and wash brushes, and he would also paint next to them or in his studio, a separate room contiguous with the collective space. The fact that Mavigné painted with them also altered institutional relations. He was no longer acting exclusively in his capacity as monitor, but as one painter alongside them. It is such shifting and practical reconfigurations of assigned roles that was key to enabling a space for visual arts appearance at Ingenio de Dentro. And I'll also just make a note here that there was an existing work therapy program, or what was called at that particular institution, occupational therapy. So patients were engaged in other activities as well. Given the recalibration of Mavigné's institutional role, I recall, if briefly, the very different conditions outlined in Michel Foucault's opening lecture on psychiatric power at the Collège de France in 1973. Foucault tracks how disciplinary power constitutes the condition of possibility for medical knowledge premised on observation, and I quote, "The relationship of objectivity, which is constitutive of medical knowledge and the criterion of its validity, is a relationship of order, a distribution of time, space, and individuals," end quote. By establishing the medical gaze's relation to its object of knowledge, knowledge is produced within this regulated distribution of power. It depends on this order. Key here is that psychiatric power for Foucault is constituted through a series of tactical and mutually reinforcing relays, networks, and reciprocal supports between doctors, nurses, and staff. Such tactical arrangements also persist across various paradigms of psychiatric care, from the 1880s or from the 1800s moral treatment to the mid-20th century's empiricist phase. In each, patients were obliged to follow the regularity of certain habits and routines, a precise diet or sustained deprivation, and endure solitary confinement, or later, by the late 1930s, punitive and therapeutic treatments like electroshock or lobotomy. Dr. Silveira actively defied the power that subtended the psychiatric order of Ingenio de Dentro by introducing different modes of care for her clients, like the painting studio, which I'm showing you again here on the left, and you can see Adelina Gomez pictured at the center in the back, but also other creative activities like theater, an image of which you see on the right. But for purposes of this talk, I'd like to linger on the painting studio's inaugural years and Mavigné's and Palachnik's presences, which should be understood as therapeutic and thus at odds with both the surrealist appropriations of psychiatric patients' work for their exhibitions, as well as John Dubuffet's equally romanticizing engagement with patients' art as an outside to official artistic culture. And so it's worth reiterating here, and I speak about this in Learning from Madness, that in correspondence with Dr. Silveira, Dubuffet rejected the categorization of her patient's art as art brut. And you can read on the slide, he says, I'll just translate it directly from the French. He says, "I must say it," this is in the second rectangle, "it is not particularly original," he's referring to the work on the right, "not particularly feverish, not particularly brut." And I think what this points to also is that Dubuffet is very invested in a particular type of aesthetic, not just that the work would be produced in a psychiatric context. In 1949, Silveira authorized Mavigné to take her client Emilio G. Bajos to the Teatro Municipal. Palachnik went with them. Emilio not only listened to the concert, but looked up from the ceiling and down from left to right. Palachnik speculates that Emilio seemed to remember earlier visits to the theater. They also regularly did paseos. Sorry, I got off on my slides. Or excursions together in Palachnik's car, sometimes too with leading art critic Mario Pedrosa, as you see here on the lower left. The group excursion to the Teatro Municipal lies at the origin of Emilio's painting, O Municipal, which you see currently on the slide, and which pictures the Teatro Municipal. Burnt red and orange yellow dominate O Municipal, both indicating the sun in the sky and highlighting the reflective surfaces of the gilded decor on the building's facade. The architectural structure, however, is put under pressure through Emilio's use of color, which is less descriptive than, at least to me, emotionally evocative. Indeed, their group visit to the theater forms part of broader shifts in patients' work at this time, enabled by what I call an acompañamiento terapéutico, or therapeutic companionship. Here, I deliberately use the term acompañamiento terapêutico in Portuguese to capture how Mavigné's work as monitor and Palachnik's repeated visits to Engenho de Dentro's painting studio resembled a therapeutic follow-up, monitoring, and support. A physician, for example, would use acompañamiento to refer to a follow-up appointment for treatment. The vocabulary is medical, but it stems from the Portuguese verb acompanhar, which is to accompany, to provide company, to go along with. The English companionship is perhaps more convivial than the meanings I aim to capture with acompañamiento, which captures Palachnik's affective labor in the years 1949 to 1951, when he regularly visited the painting studio, always on Saturdays and always with Mavigné. The creation of a bridge through companionship between our world and the world of the schizophrenic led Silveira to theorize what she called afecto catalizador, or affective catalyst. She explains, and I quote, "I'm accustomed to saying that the studio monitor functions like a type of catalyst," end quote. While a catalyst accelerates reactions, an inhibiting agency slows them down or prevents them. She thus says that among people who have contact with the sick, doctors, nurses, monitors, you have catalysts and inhibitors. She explains, and I quote, "Without a doubt, the same individual could work as a catalyst for one person and an inhibitor for another," end quote. Rather than close the mad circle of psychiatric power described by Foucault, in this therapeutic scenario of acompañamiento terapéutico, with a conception of affect at its center, Silveira embraces the ineffable knowledge brought by interpersonal relations and their chemistry. Such ineffableness reminds me of how Silveira would always insist, and I quote, "Technical knowledge does not constitute everything in a profession. The human in each person, the sensibility, the intuition are precious qualities," end quote. From relations of violence and discipline, Silveira reconfigures hospital relations as those of therapeutic companionship and affective catalysts, even as she remained tethered to the knowledge she might gain through studying her patient's art. As I've tracked in my book, Learning from Madness, such relations with the external world went beyond enabling the client's aesthetic production and extended to their work's exhibition in official cultural venues in Brazil. Mavigné organized important exhibitions of the client's work, photographed the installations of the exhibitions, and encouraged art world figures to visit the painting studio, ultimately resulting in the celebrated exhibition Nove Artistas de Engenho de Dentro of Rio de Janeiro, which opened at the Museum of Modern Art in Sao Paulo in October 1949. And I'm showing you on the right an installation of the client's work in 1949 at the Museum of Modern Art. In the case of Silveira, it has been her turn to Jung and her symbolic interpretations of her client's images that has been her primary legacy. And this interpretive lens defines much of the research at the Museu de Imagens do Inconsciente, or the Museum of Unconscious Images, which she founded in 1952 for the collection and preservation of her client's work. And so the collection today is comprised of over more than 400,000 works And it presents an instance, few globally, of clients' work not being commercialized at this moment at the mid-century. Indeed, she rigorously tracked the appearance of mythical themes in her clients' work, like in the case of Daphne, which I'm showing you here, in the works by Adelina Gomez. But her adherence to a Jungian framework might well also explain her relative obscurity in the French psychiatric context, where practitioners and artists were often tethered to Freud's and Lacan's theories. This said, I don't want to underestimate the institutional effects of Silveira's commitment to expressive activities and the role of therapeutic companionship and her team of affective catalysts. Silveira did not develop theories around the psychiatric institution like Tosquelles, who would elaborate and practice institutional psychotherapy, even though she shared with him a concern for the hospital's internal life, the patient population, its working groups, their interrelations with the staff, with the administration, and with the doctors. What is more, neither Silveira nor Tosquelles favored the absolute abolishment of the psychiatric hospital, which would become key to discussions in radical psychiatry in the 1960s and 70s. As Joanna Massot succinctly affirms regarding Tosquelles, and I quote, "The dream of the hospital disappearing was not Tosquelles' dream," end quote. Rather, Silveira shifted the hospital environment in such a way to reestablish her clients' connections with the external world, for which the studio monitors like Mavigné, visitors like Palachnik, and leading art critic Mario Pedrosa all played a key role. Accordingly, at the level of the institution, she notes, and I quote, "The attempts to return to the external world become more firm and lasting if, in the environment where the ill person lives, they find the support of affect," end quote. And so I'm showing you here, again, just so you have a sense of how the activities also extended to the grounds of the hospital. And then this is a painting studio that continues its work today on the site of the Museum of Unconscious Images. That such catalyzing affect also served as the groundwork for later calls to patients' social integration is echoed in the work of psychiatrist and psychoanalyst Neusa Santos Souza, whose volume, Tornarse Negro, Becoming Black, of 1982, was a point of reference alongside Frantz Fanon for addressing racism in Brazil, both politically and psychically. She worked at the Núcleo de Atendimento Terapêutico, or the therapeutic care nucleus at Engenho de Dentro. In addition to her clinical seminars, Souza embraced the art's connections to clinical practice. In relation to visual art, in her posthumously published essay, Locar a quem serve arte, or Mad Art, Who Does Art Serve? Souza reflects on art, noting how, and I quote, and you can read along with me on the slide, art serves as creative, criadora in Portuguese, activity, a field of actualizing the inventive possibilities of the subject. She continues, this should be true for all artists, and especially for the mad artist. And then what is key to her work is also how psychic suffering intersects with racial oppression, and how through art, and now the final quote, the treatment of the mad is defined, in essence, by the recuperation of social ties, end quote. Calling upon the speech of one of Silveira's clients, artist Fernando Diniz, Souza reports how he would repeat, and I quote, "If I was rich, if I had money, I would make a small house for me," end quote. And I'm showing you two examples of his painting, of his works, one painting and one drawing on the left-hand side of the image. Souza reports how it's necessary to listen to Deniz's words, the words of the artist, the words of the mad, in order to understand them and their world. In addition to painting and drawing, Diniz also made a film, with which I would like to conclude. Because he did not possess a camera, he started to draw film frames, one after another, and ultimately worked with filmmaker Marcos Magalhães on Estrela de Oito Pontos, or Star with 8 Points, from 1996, in which viewers see Diniz at work producing a large-scale painting of abstract design, as well as modeling objects with clay. Intertitles reproduce Deniz's speech, and I quote, "I've been waiting for 50 years to get into the university." Or, it's in the middle of this slide, "The image wasn't made to dream. The image was made to work." Denise's film concludes with a horse and rider animation that leads viewers into a largely abstract sequence. According to Magalhães, this final sequence was completed on an animation table at Fornaci Studios and is the only scene for which Denise used professional recording and a lightbox. It is undoubtedly on account of its hand-drawn animation and aesthetic complexities that Estrela de Oito Pontos won Best Directing, Best Editing, Best Music in the Festival de Cinema de Gramado, held in Gramado, Brazil in 1996, and won Best Animation in the Festival Internacional de Nuevo Cine Latinoamericano, otherwise known as the Havana Film Festival, in 1997. With the recognition of his work at cultural festivals, Denise not only established social ties, his work was at once affirmed as a contribution to artistic and filmic culture writ large. What Denise and Magalhães' collaboration reveal is a shift in register, with artistic practices enabled in the context of psychiatric reform from the mid-1980s to the present, from a model of therapeutic companionship to a more robust model of cultural citizenship, whereby such production is celebrated outside a therapeutic frame and beyond exclusionary categories like outsider art or even art brut. Tracking such modes of cultural citizenship is at the heart of my forthcoming book, Deviant Art Histories. The work of the artists of Engenho de Dentro, again now pictured on the slide, contributed to a specific form of Brazilian-based modernism through their work's inclusion in official artistic venues, though such aesthetic inclusion, to be sure, did not redress their makers' social exclusion. The community of figures, including Nisa da Silveira, professional artists such as Mavigné and Palachnik, and critics like Pedrosa, came together in an alternative therapeutic network, one grounded in catalyzing affect, to pave the way for the acceptance of psychic difference, for an understanding of these clients as artistic practitioners, and even if in inchoate fashion, as protagonists of art and culture. Like Denise, a protagonism and subjective reinvention that continues to inform the debates and ongoing practices of psychiatric reform in Brazil. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kyra. Thank you so much, Valerie. Thank you so much, Raphael, for your contributions. I'm hoping you can join me there. Hi, Valerie. It's good to see you. While just a reminder to everybody in the audience, please feel free to put any comments or questions in the chat or in the Q&A. The privilege of the moderator is to start the questions, which I am really thrilled to be able to do. And I wanted to thank all three of you for really exciting starting points for our conversation today. So I wanted to start, if we could, by asking the question that is essentially the title of this panel, right? Was Saint-Albin a, quote, laboratory for the arts? But I want to do it in such a way that it also takes up the subtitle of this exhibition in its New York iteration. So the subtitle, for those of you who might not remember it, I'm sure Valerie remembers it extremely well, is Avant-Garde Psychiatry and the Birth of Art Brut. And I find this phrasing, both the separate phrases as well as the conjunction of the two phrases, both really evocative and provocative. And full disclosure, I've used the term psychiatric avant-garde, so a sort of alternative format, to refer to a much earlier moment of kind of self-declared reformers in Paris in and around 1900. But I was hoping that I could ask each of you in turn to kind of take up this phrase in light of your own presentations, and perhaps exploring what these two phrases, so the phrase avant-garde psychiatry and the phrase birth of Art Brut, in conjunction, what those phrases assume or reveal or occlude and or construct. So in other words, it's a little bit, for those of you who were there yesterday, or just to say we did quite a bit of work yesterday and sort of the politics of naming. So I'm interested to really hear from you your thoughts on what the political work of this subtitle is.
I'm happy to
Go ahead. Yeah.
jump in. I think it's well. First of all, thank you to all panelists like for your presentations. It was really really fantastic, and I think this is like a great framing to start the conversation. So yeah, thank you so much, Alison. I think starting with the notion of avant-garde and taking it seriously and kind of unpacking it would be a nice way. Specifically, and I think this is really something that has to be brought into the debate. The general question, who killed the avant-garde, right? So can you still talk about the avant-garde after 45? Is it a neo-avant-garde or a little bit? Or like, so this is like an endless debate with a kind of also equally endless bibliography. But I think something that is really important to notice here, and Mariana Jacobi has done like great work editing this correspondence, is that there's a kind of thorough correspondence between Dubuffet and Jean Paulhan, specifically surrounding these notions, right? Giselle Sapiro is also someone who thought about the role of Paulhan post-45. So it's a very kind of complex framing. I'll try to kind of summarize it in one sentence. Basically, Paulhan was the center of gravity of French avant-gardes since like the 1920s. Started as like many of you know very well, like careers of Artaud. Maybe Cara, you can talk about that. Like was really instrumental in all of these developments, and then and was part of a National Committee for Resistance, right? So he was in a very powerful position, both in terms of being a kind of kingmaker in the art world and the literary world, and being kind of in a strong political position after 45. So he was in touch with Dubuffet about not just art brut at all, but just how to position themselves within culture at the time. The leading thought by Paulhan was that basically avant-garde had to be completely redefined, or what it meant for any form of artistic literary radicalism. His primary motive was anti-communism, so he was against any type of social commitment. And if we take the Peter Bürger definition of the avant-garde, like having the kind of social commitment aspect is part of the avant-garde definition, to emphasize individualized forms of radicalism. Like late Artaud would be a good example. It allowed him to have interesting reconciliations with collaborationist writers like Jouandeau, for instance, who had brought back into the fold under this umbrella of like the individualized radicalism. So I think this is like a very important moment that echoes to the present day about how any type of radical artistic intervention is redefined and cut off from like social commitments. And I think Dubuffet was very much subscribing to this for a number of reasons that we can go into. Like he was very much a partner of Paulhan at this specific point in time, whereas the Saint-Alban experiment, I would say, qualifies as avant-garde because it's really, if we take seriously the kind of traditional Peter Bürger definition of having this kind of social side, rethinking kind of social organization. So that would be kind of my take on it. See how somehow I would say, to phrase it very provocatively, Paulhan killed the avant-garde with Dubuffet, and we can see that in their correspondence, beautifully edited by Mariana Jacobi. Yeah.
We may circle back to you on the birth of art brut question, but Valérie, did you want to? I'm sort of assuming that you may have had a hand also in this title and have some special insight as well.
Yes, and I think it bounces back. My answer will go back to what Joanna and Carlos were trying to explain yesterday in terms of how to bring within a museum context an idea about psychiatry and try to to illustrate this idea through different documents and objects. And I think it was a real challenge to do it. As they explained, it was these different archives were dispersed in various holdings and in various like contexts, and just to gather them together for an exhibition was a challenge. So what we have challenged with the title of the exhibition, which, has changed along the road in the 4 different venues. So we wanted to make sure that for an American public, but also for a museum, an art museum like ours, specialized in showing since 1961 works by untrained, self-taught folk artists, to speak to this idea of the birth, this idea of the beginning of how a notion has been developed and intersect with art history. And I think what we wanted to emphasize is that this is this very moment when Jean Dubuffet saw the works of Forestier at Hérouard's house. That was like really a turning point that brought him from a moment of his artistic career, a moment of his interest to collect documents and gather a memory of, uncompromised, if you want, creative expressions, and in a moment where he started to gather objects. And I think the exhibition very much crystallized this idea that without his very unique a unique initiative in preserving, in the ethnographic sense of the term, preserving a memory, a material culture. I don't think that we could have done this exhibition, and we realized that many of the objects that we were trying to gather for the show were either too damaged, too difficult to travel to the US. I mean, there's a real evidence into the fact that many of these objects are survivors, and that Dubuffet's approach to bring them together, conserve them, and create a documentation about them was a very unique project that came to us as and still need to be unpacked with all its contradictions. But that was really the beginning of this interaction, beginning of this of a more like constructed conceptualization that would be the best channel to intersect with the story of Tosquelles and located. Actually, we wanted to at some point for the title of the show use the geographical location of Saint-Alban as being the point of entry, and we kept going back and forth and realized that this emphasis on the intersection between Tosquelles and Dubuffet was the core of how we could start to unpack these legacies and these constellations at AFAM. I can come back with other parts of the question later, but I would like to leave Keira answer this question too.
Thanks.
Hi, thanks everybody for your responses. I guess I see Art Brut as a category that needs to be historicized, and it doesn't really have purchase in the Brazilian context. I mean, that's part of the reason why I put up the Dubuffet quote. He did beyond, I mean, he was searching not only in Saint-Alban, I mean, he was also writing to various psychiatrists globally. So he didn't write just to Nisa da Silveira, he also wrote to Osorio Cesar. He endorsed the works from one psychiatric asylum in Brazil, but not the ones of Silveira's patients, which I think is kind of interesting and speaks again to a particular aesthetic that he was interested in. I mean, for me to bring the Brazilian context into view is just to think about more globally how many of these, let's say, avant-garde psychiatry propositions are happening internal to various institutions before the actual kind of, let's say, formal onset of radical psychiatry in the 60s and 70s and the abolishment of various psychiatric institutions. The one thing, just, following up on what Rafael was saying, is that I don't think that necessarily even qualifying something as avant-garde psychiatry necessarily means that some of the practitioners don't continue to use what by today's standards would be considered violent means. So, Tosquelles did practice electroshock. And I think that's just something to kind of, one of the medical contradictions that I don't know if it came up yesterday in conversation to also keep in mind. So, so it was multiple births, let's say, not just one birth. and it was a network, and things appeared. And in terms of the, you know, politics of naming, and I think it was Mathilde at the outset talked about, you know, how in some cases we're using historical terms. Today in Brazil, the client is generally used to talk about psychiatric patients, or usuarios da psiquiatria. So the imperfect English translation of psychiatric users. That's just to give some partial response to your question, Allison. Thank you.
I just want to like lift some comments also from the chat, which are kind of bring them in here as well. Just to a comment from Kent Minturn mentioning that Paul Hahn also absorbed the Abrut project into his Cahiers de la Pléiade. And Carlos reminds us that the title of the exhibition when it was presented in Barcelona and Madrid was Francesc Tosquelles, like a sewing machine in a wheat field. And he comments that, you know, yes, avant-garde, but somehow sort of a twisted and retorted take on this. And I think I'll stick with another question on naming here, just while we're on the topic and the politics of institutions and their categories. So Tom Mitchell asks or says, the placing of this exhibition in an institution of folk art raises the question, are the MAD a folk comparable to ethnic groups, tribes, cults, vanguards, etc.? In other words, why put this work in a folk art museum? So I'll throw that one out there to continue. Kyra?
Well, I was just going to say that had the exhibition been taken to Brazil, it wouldn't have been in the Museu de Arte Popular. It would have been at the Museum of Modern Art. Brazil has a long-standing history of including such work in major biennials, major institutions. So I think it's part of kind of limitation of the US context in terms of the history of mental health and the creative production of people adjacent to or, you know, inscribed within mental health institutions.
And should I continue this thought?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I was thinking that, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's something that I mean, if we want to go back to the Saint Alban experiment, Tosquelles' idea was really to kind of have kind of as much as possible a non kind of hierarchical approach. He even says things like le patient déconne, je déconne à mon tour. So somehow having a matching delirium for the patient and kind of being in this process of translation that between subjectivities, but without the notion that the MAD would be somehow like a distinct kind of tribal population of any kind, like emphasizing the kind of this kind of approach that is straight in line with like Freud, for instance, psychopathology of everyday life, like showing like that there is no essentialized kind of boundary. And it's very much something that Canguilhem was invested in doing when he published his PhD dissertation on the normal and the pathological just a few months before coming to Saint Alban, and he was part of his discussions. Very much so. So I think this is an important point, and also I wanted to kind of go back to the notion of art brut and kind of piggyback on what Caro was saying about the specific type of aesthetics. I think it's really important absolutely Dubuffet was selecting a very narrow bandwidth of objects that were fitting within his definition, so figurative, and figurative that could be reminiscent of a period, let's say second period Giacometti, and as opposed to Prinzhorn, for instance, who loved geometry. I was mentioning at another conference the fact that Wilhelm Worringer said that he hated cave painting, prehistoric cave painting, and only cared about geometric patterns in a Neolithic pottery. So it's really about the way in which a very specific aesthetic agenda is invested into a narrow selection of works and presented as nature. I think that's also an important point, presented as like a naturalized category. And I think if we want to go high theoretical, I think this is a trademark of ideology to confuse nature and culture, to like have this kind of very culturally specific selection and pretend that it's a kind of natural category of production. And also, I think the category of ideology in the full meaning of the word is like very operative for Art Brut, because Art Brut doesn't suffer from internal contradictions, I think, which is also, if we take seriously the definition of ideology by even people like Pierre Macheret, for instance, is like a defining feature of ideology, that somehow it can absorb contradictions within its definition, because it's not a rationalized type of discourse. So I think, and I would say, if we look at what Barthes is saying about ideologies that are floating around at the time in mythologies, I think it applies very neatly to Dubuffet's discourses. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a very, thank you for raising that point, Raphael, about what Kara mentioned about the specific type of aesthetic that he was collecting. And indeed, during the first years of his activity, he was very much focusing on works that translate this precarity or this fragility. It was like a common thread in the works he has acquired at the beginning. But somehow, and I would like to ask Kara to reflect on the type of artworks also that were produced in the context of Nisa de Silveira's workshop, or of art therapy, if you want. But it's interesting that Dubuffet somehow explained or resisted the more traditional way of creating art, what art could be like, meaning like paint on canvas or frameworks, and he was staying away of these type of expressions, if you want. And the same way you resisted to the category of naive art, the works of Henri Rousseau or Séraphine Louis, on the same for the same reason, because they were in his viewpoint, from his viewpoint, they were creators who were trying to imitate what real artists were using as materials of creation. But in a different way also, when he referred to, he asked Uri to write his essay on Forestier, Uri formulated something very interesting. He said, one cannot make through things, living things, out of dead things. And I think he had really like this idea of seeing materials like discarded objects from society, like object that Forestier might have found on the site of the hospital, as an expression, a form of subversions, if you want, a form of a symbolism of these objects being similar to the social culturally repressed individuals living in a hospital. And I was curious if Kara was having a remark or an observation about the work that were produced in the context of the art therapy sessions of Nisa de Silveira, as opposed to the collection of Jean Dubuffet.
If you want me to speak to the aesthetics, it's less the aesthetics that preoccupies me, the aesthetics of the output of those clients, than the fact that, independent of whether they're in an art therapy workshop or in a situation of, let's say, labor therapy, that Dubuffet is constantly isolating the artistic production from the social network in which the works are produced. So, Dubuffet has very strong feelings against art therapy, because he believes it's about bringing the individual back to be rehabilitated to the conventions of the dominant culture. And so that is in part what motivates, I think, his rejection of Silveira's work. I mean, that's what he says in his letters, right? That he's like, these are obviously patients who are being guided by somebody who has an aesthetic eye, right? They are not isolated, working by themselves, on this desert, which I think was the metaphor that Raphael brought up. So I think it's more the question of like cutting them from all modes of sociability. And but the aesthetic works that are produced at Ingenio de Dentro, I mean, of course, the dominant mythology is that they had no assistance, but they did. I mean, I write about this. So there are various ways in which the work was encouraged or kind of created within the conditions of that I call an assisted modernism. So, yeah.
mean, some of the examples that have been brought up suggest to me that there's much work to be done in looking at the specific instances, and you mentioned just one by citing the letter from Dubuffet of the things that either don't get in the category, or the things that get into the category of Ablut, but only with sort of certain kind of rhetorical assistance or certain kind of institutional assistance or kind of fascinating kind of machinations. But we don't have a huge amount of time, so I want to go to one of the other questions in the Q&A from John Losicero. I'm so sorry if I've pronounced that incorrectly. We accept UNICEF postcards of children's art that commodify affect, but does the cultural citizenship of patient art enlarge on this tradition of developmental psychology? Is that something anyone would like to take up? Or perhaps there's also a brand new comment in the Q&A as well about electroshock, but go ahead, Kyra, I see you unmuted yourself.
I'm just reading the question because
Yeah.
I wasn't sure I followed it. The only thing I can respond to that is I use cultural citizenship as a term that was developed actually in the Latino context in the 1980s about the rights claiming agencies of minority populations. And so the right to produce culture, right? Not something external to culture, but actually part of culture itself, which in part is informed by my own situatedness in terms of my research in the Brazilian context and how these works are inscribed within dominant cultural institutions and part of dominant histories of art. So cultural citizenship conceived in that way. I'm not too sure I can respond to the UNICEF postcards of children's art.
Thank you. Just lifting the remark from Jean Calfa on Kyra's remark on electroshocks, Fanon and Tosquelles wrote that those who criticize these techniques manifest, they say, un préjugé théorique très fréquent sur la fixité du caractère, la fixité des soi-disant constitutions. They saw these techniques as a liberating first step, but they strongly opposed lobotomy, which precisely fixed a pathological character. I wonder if we might go in the last few minutes. I did want to return to another part of the discussion yesterday about sort of the continual oscillation or pendulum shift between abolitionist discourse and reforming discourse. And I'm wondering if anyone would like to weigh in on how they see creative production in the specific context of Saint-Albin, in the context that you were talking about in Brazil, or in any other context. Where does creative production sort of fit in to that pendulum swing between different discourses of the institution?
I can just think about one aspect of this answer that relates more to a letter that I was reading between Dr. Gentil and Dubuffet in the context of the selling of one of the large wall panel that was produced by Clément Fraisse on the site of Saint-Alban, and this question of the value of the works, and currently that bounces back on the value of the works of individuals like Fraisse and Forestier and people today still producing in the context of art therapy or workshops, and the value of these works on the market, and that tension is already perceptible when Dubuffet, who openly wants to pay his due, wants to pay for the works of Forestier, when came the moment for him to to pay for the large panel of Clément Fraisse, and he engaged in a correspondence with Clément Fraisse, and he said, please let me know what kind of how I can support this purchase. And Clément Fraisse writes back. He said, well, I would like maybe to have a little car and maybe like a garage for my car. And Dubuffet got completely like destabilized by this by this question, by this proposal, and sent back a letter saying that he was not thinking about something as big. And Clément Fraisse answered something very interesting. He said, well, I spent 2 years working on this wall in terrible conditions, and it was very hard for me. And I believe that my work was equal to this kind of value. But anyway, so this is interesting to see that even today, and I'm more aware of that because at the museum we are acquiring works and we are seeing the price for these works circulating on the market, and there's it seems to have a blockage in terms of, because these works were produced by individuals that do not actively belong to these artistic networks, would get a plateau in terms of how much can people pay for these works. And I think I just wanted to bring back this socioeconomical aspect of the creators and how it keeps affecting the value in terms of commodity or objects on the market for these works, and it's still like something that that needs to be addressed.
Well, go ahead, Raphael.
No, I mean, please go ahead. I'll jump in.
No, I was just going to ask Kyra if she had anything to note about the market in Brazil, whether it follows a similar pattern, or because this is something that has, you know, as Valerie was just saying, not been researched nearly enough, and the sort of provenance issues and market issues around these categories.
Well, the historical moment, most of the works are in psychiatric collections, so they raise other ethical issues in terms of the works not having been the property of the client producing it at the time, but being the property of the psychiatrist. And that's very much cast in relief with the 1950 exhibition, La Psychopathologique, which happened at Sainte-Anne. What I wanted to say in terms of art's appearance within, you know, not necessarily attending to the like abolition reformist back and forth, but you know, for me the most persuasive moments of client social integration is really happening in theater in Brazil. So like Wien's theater group, which Peter Paul Pelbart, who's a philosopher, is at the helm. You have people with various neurodivergencies or behavioral issues, therapists, professional actors, and they perform. And it's never noted, you know, whose professional designation, but the idea is to practice theater, right? It's not to practice therapy. And the idea is not necessarily to produce good theater, but it is to practice theater. And theater is the main frame and the attention to which all of the rehearsals go toward. And so I think that that's just, you know, it's a nuance, it's a break, but it is a break with having it famed therapeutically. It's a break with the, you know, object production of the solitary artist producing a work to a collective expression, which is quite meaningful.
I wanted to answer the same question about basically asking also a question of anti-psychiatry, right, and how Saint-Alban stands towards this specific movement. So, I mean, as it was mentioned yesterday that Saint-Alban, and I think Carlos said it, but that Tosquelles was very much someone who was thinking about institutions. He was not anti-psychiatrist in any way. But something that is interesting to look into is kind of an early moment of I don't think we can call it anti-psychiatry, but a serious critique of a psychiatric institution around psychiatrists associated with Saint-Alban, but who are not at Saint-Alban necessarily. Like, for instance, Louis Le Guillon, who was corresponding with Bonafé, and was very much invested in kind of drawing kind of lessons from what had happened basically during the Second World War. So both like the enormous mortality rates within French psychiatric institutions, patients who like were left to starve to death basically, and also kind of drawing in lessons from what was starting to be known as concentration camps, basically, and kind of applying that to psychiatric reform. And there are like really powerful texts from this era. I quoted like a small snippet of it at the end of my catalog essay from Le Guillon Bonafé, where they have this kind of broad multi-directional memory style way of saying that the psychiatric institution has to be rethought critically because people who are institutionalized can be compared to, and they have a whole category, a whole list of endangered, disenfranchised minorities, and that in a way, this kind of differential power dynamic within the institution has to be criticized. So even though it is not anti-psychiatry, it is very much like the seeds of it, or the seeds of like a very thorough critique of psychiatric institutions. And I think it's really interesting to see how early it's happening in the 1950s. And yeah, Louis Le Guillon, for instance, is like a really interesting figure who I think has not been kind of thoroughly kind of studied or researched so far. I'll write his name in the chat.
But I think, as we kind of evoked yesterday, I mean, critique, reform, you know, it's a feature of institutions, right, from the get-go. It's a feature of psychiatry from the get-go, and I'm talking about the early 19th century. And it's so I guess the question becomes, you know, to what extent, how is critique incorporated? How is critique dispersed? How is critique and reform propagandized, right? You know, and what role does art then have to play in that? And I'm thinking again, I live in the 1890s, and I'm thinking about certain kinds of practices that, you know, are sort of propaganda for a kind of reforming psychiatric discourse. And I'm thinking about then other kind of practices, like the feminist novelist Emily Scram, who writes like an anti-psychiatric novel, right, which actually has an effect. It like gets somebody fired. Somebody has to resign because of this, you know, this piece of art that she's written, a kind of auto-fictional novel. So then I guess this is what I'm trying to kind of get at, is where does art sit usually? Where do creative productions sit? And of course, it depends on, you know, under whose auspices they're created, exhibited, displayed, you know, sold. But where does creative production typically sit in there?
I think yeah,
sorry,
go ahead. No, I was just going to say,
yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say that I think it resides in various places, right? I don't think it sits in one place. And certainly it's not stable in one place across contexts either, right? So it could be the novelist who gets somebody fired, art used as a kind of reformist way, or in another situation that I deal with in my forthcoming book, where artists take up residence in the asylum in Trieste. And it is thanks to their residence that they disturb the relationships of power within the asylum, and the asylum actually opens its doors, never to be closed again. So that's a real concrete moment in which artists actually destabilized the functioning and, you know, kind of began the dismantling of the first asylum to be closed in the European context. So I think I think it's shifts, different permutations. I always have these like permutational charts of how these things end up operating, but it sits differently in different places and at different time periods as well. So I don't know, Raphael, if you wanted to, I'm sorry for the short circuit.
I just wanted to echo what Alison was saying. Yeah, I think it's important to like be mindful of what Foucault describes as the kind of Pinel moments of liberation, kind of like grandiose, kind of breaking the kind of shackles, and actually and always have a kind of keep a kind of critical distance. But I think it's really interesting to see how like the kind of Saint-Albin experiment, through a lot of transformations and thorough critiques, putting things on the head, and like the kind of engendered or birthed, to like keep this using this metaphor, other things, let's say the thinking of like Felix Guattari, or the way in which I mean, as Jean-Carl demonstrated, Fanon kind of elaborated a different type of framework for psychiatry, kind of deciding what worked and what did not work in the Saint-Alban experiment as applied to his own experiences in Blida and beyond. So I think it's really a kind of a great kind of testament to the value of the Saint-Alban experiment is how it was not just criticizing psychiatry, but how it was itself generative as something that was critiqued, overcome, but like leading to other developments, basically.
Thank you. I see Matilda has turned her camera on, which I think means that we need to wrap up.
Yes, but I don't want to cut you off. It's such an interesting conversation, and we all learned a lot today with you all. So let me know if there is anything you'd like to add before I wrap up.
I think I saw Valerie just unmute for a sec.
Okay, so I'd like to thank you all today for this remarkable presentation and this wonderful conversation. And thank you, Alison, for this gracious and very thoughtful companionship and moderation of the panel. I think that was also very important as a femme, as we talked about the context of this invitation and the exhibition, to think about terms like art brut and historicism. So this is something we're really committed to also at the museum and also throughout our programming. So thank you for doing this work for us today, and also we'll continue thinking about the connection between art, modernism, and postmodernism in the second session. We have half-hour break before we reconvene, and we will also talk a lot about institutional critique and the question of institution and their role in the making of art, and how psychiatry was criticized, can be criticized also through art making. And I'll see you in half hour, and thank you all. The panel is called From Occupational Therapy to Disability Art and starts at 1:30 p.m. New York time. Thank you again.